Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books out loud while stoned. In this video, we're going to start a new Little Blue Book. It is Little Blue Book number 139, titled Crimes Against Criminals, an address by Robert G Ingersoll. And if you follow my videos, I just finished the Little Blue Book 1215 about Robert G Ingersoll. So I thought we'll just follow it up with one of his addresses that he's fairly famous for, called Crimes Against Criminals. And he gave this address. It was delivered before the New York State Bar Association at Albany, New York. January 21st, 1890. Now, along with being one of the greatest orators of his time, he was also a lawyer, and a fairly famous one, making at least $100,000 a year back in, that was it. He died in 1899 of a heart attack at the age of 65, I believe. And so this is 9 years before his death that he gave this speech to the this address to the New York Bar Association. January 21st of 1890. Crimes Against Criminals. In this brief, oh my goodness, you'd think I wasn't reading here. In this brief address, the object is to suggest there being no time to present arguments at length. The subject has been chosen for the reason that it is one that should interest the legal profession, because that profession, to a certain extent, controls and shapes the legislation of our country and fixes definitely the scope and meaning of all laws. Lawyers ought to be foremost in legislative and judicial reform, and of all men, they should understand the philosophy of mind, the causes of human action, and the real science of government. It has been said that the three pests of a community are a priest without charity, a doctor without knowledge, and a lawyer without a sense of justice. And here begins his address. All nations seem to have had supreme confidence in the deterrent power of threatened and inflicted pain. They have regarded punishment as the shortest road to reformation. Imprisonment, torture, death constituted a trinity under which protection society might feel secure. In addition to these, nations have relied on confiscation and degradation, on maimings, whippings, brandings, and exposure to public ridicule and contempt. Connected with the court of justice was the chamber of torture. The ingenuity of man was exhausted in the construction of instruments that would surely reach the most sensitive nerve. All this was done in the interest of civilization, for the protection of virtue and well-being of states. Curiously enough, the fact is that no matter how severe the punishments were, the crimes increased. If we found that the penalty of death made little difference, thieves and highwaymen, heretics and blasphemers went on their way. It was then thought necessary to add to this penalty of death, and consequently the convicted were tortured in every conceivable way before execution. They were broken on the wheel, their joints dislocated on the rack. They were suspended by their legs and arms while immense weights were placed upon their breasts. Their flesh was burned and torn with hot irons. They were roasted at slow fires. They were buried alive, given to wild beasts. Molten lead was poured in their ears. Their eyelids were cut off, and the wretches placed with their faces toward the sun. Others were securely bound so that they could move neither hand nor foot, and over their stomachs were placed inverted bulls. Under these bulls rats were confined. On top of the bulls were heaped coals of fire, so that the rats, in their efforts to escape, would gnaw into the bowels of the victims. They were staked out on the sands of the sea to be drowned by the slowly rising tide, and every means by which human nature can be overcome slowly, painfully, and terribly were conceived and carried into execution. And yet, the number of so-called criminals increased. For petty offenses, men were degraded, given to the mercy of the rabble. Their ears were cut off, their nostrils slit, their foreheads branded. They were tied to the tails of carts and flogged from one town to another. And yet, in spite of all, the poor wretches obstinately refused to become good and useful citizens. Degradation has been thoroughly tried, with its maimings and brandings, and the results that those who inflicted the punishments became as degraded as their victims. Only a few years ago, there were more than 200 offenses in Great Britain punishable by death. The gallows tree bore fruit through all the year, and the hangman was the busiest official in the kingdom. But the criminals increased. Crimes were committed to punish crimes, and crimes were committed to prevent crimes. The world has been filled with prisons and dungeons, with chains and whips, with crosses and giblets, with thumbscrews and racks, with hangmen and headsmen. And yet, these frightful means and instrumentalities and crimes have accomplished little for the preservation of property or life. It is safe to say that governments have committed far more crimes than they have prevented. Why is it that man will suffer and risk so much for the sake of stealing? Why will they accept degradation and punishment and infamy as their portion? Some will answer this question by an appeal to the dogma of original sin. Others by saying that millions of men and women are under the control of fiends, that they are actually possessed by devils, and others will declare that all these people act from choice, that they are possessed of free wills, of intelligence, that they know and appreciate consequences, and that in spite of all, they deliberately prefer a life of crime. Have we not advanced far enough intellectually to deny the existence of chance? Are we not satisfied now that back of every act and thought and dream and fancy is an efficient cause? Is anything, or can anything, be produced that is not necessarily produced? Can the fatherless and motherless exist? Is there not a connection between all events, and is not every act related to all other acts? Is it not possible? Is it not probable? Is it not true that the actions of all men are determined by countless causes over which they have no positive control? Certain it is that men do not prefer unhappiness to joy. It can hardly be said that man intends permanently to injure himself, and that he does what he does in order that he may live a life of misery. On the other hand, we must take it for granted that man endeavors to better his own condition, and seeks, although by mistaken ways, his own well-being. The poorest man would like to be rich. The sick desire health, and no sane man wishes to win the contempt and hatred of his fellow men. Every human being prefers liberty to imprisonment. Are the brains of criminals exactly like the brains of honest men? Have criminals the same ambitions, the same standards of happiness or of well-being? If a difference exists in brain, will that in part account for the difference in character? Is there anything in heredity? Are vices as carefully transmitted by nature as virtues? Does each man in some degree bear burdens imposed by ancestors? We know that disease of flesh and blood are transmitted, that the child is the heir of physical deformity. Are diseases of the brain, are deformities of the soul, of the mind also transmitted? We not only admit, but we assert that in the physical world there are causes and effects. We insist that there is and can be no effect without an efficient cause. When anything happens in that world, we are satisfied that it was naturally and necessarily produced. The causes may be obscure, but we are implicitly believe in their existence, as when we know positively what they are. In the physical world, we have taken the ground that there is nothing miraculous, that everything is natural. And if we cannot explain it, we account for our inability to explain by our own ignorance. Is it not possible, is it not probable that what is true in the physical world is equally true in the realm of mind, in the strange world of passion and desire? Is it possible that thoughts or desires or passions are the children of chance, born of nothing? Can we conceive of nothing as a force or as a cause? If, then, there is behind every thought and desire and passion an efficient cause, we can in part at least account for the actions of men. A certain man, under certain conditions, acts in a certain way. There are certain temptations that he, with his brain, with his experience, with his intelligence, with his surroundings, cannot withstand. He is irresistibly led to do or impelled to do certain things, and there are other things that he cannot do. If we change the conditions of this man, his actions will change. Develop his mind, give him new subjects of thought, and you change the man. And the man, being changed, it follows of necessity that his conduct will be different. In civilized countries, the struggle for existence is severe, the competition far sharper than in savage lands. The consequence is that there are many failures. These failures lack, it may be, opportunity or brain or moral force or industry, or something without which, under the circumstances, success is impossible. Certain lines of conduct are called legal, and certain others criminal, and the men who fail in one line may be driven to the other. How do we know that it is impossible for all men to be honest? Are we certain that all people can tell the truth? Is it possible for all men to be generous or candid or courageous? I am perfectly satisfied that there are millions of people incapable of committing certain crimes, and it may be true that there are millions of others incapable of practicing certain virtues. We do not blame a man because he is not a sculptor, a poet, a painter, or a statesman. We say he has not the genius. Are we certain that it does not require genius to be good? Where is the man with intelligence enough to take into consideration the circumstances of each individual case? Who has the mental balance with which to weigh the forces of heredity, of want, of temptation? And who can analyze with certain the mysterious motions of the brain? Where and what are the sources of vice and virtue? In what obscure and shadowy recesses of the brain are passions born? And what is that for the moment destroys the sense of right and wrong? Who knows to what extent reason becomes the prisoner of passion, of some strange and wild desire, the seeds of which were sown, it may be, thousands of years ago in the breast of some savage? To what extent do ancestors and surroundings affect the moral sense? Is it not possible that the tyranny of governments, the injustice of nations, the fierceness of what is called the law produces in the individual a tendency in the same direction? Is it not true that the citizen is apt to imitate his nation? Society degrades its enemies. The individual seeks to degrade his. Society plunders its enemies, and now and then the citizen has the desire to plunder his. Society kills its enemies and possibly sows in the heart of some citizens the seeds of murder. Is it not true that the criminal is a natural product, and that society unconsciously produces these children of vice? Can we not safely take another step and say that the criminal is a victim, as the diseased and insane and deformed are victims? We do not think of punishing a man because he is afflicted with disease. Our desire is to cure him. We find him not to the penitentiary, but to the hospital, to an asylum. We do this because we recognize the fact that disease is naturally produced, that it is inherited from parents or the result of unconscious negligence, or it may be of recklessness. But instead of punishing, we pity. If there are diseases of the mind, of the brain, as there are diseases of the body, and if these diseases of the mind, these deformities of the brain produce and necessarily produce what we call vice, why should we punish the criminal and pity those who are physically diseased? Socrates, in some respects, at least one of the wisest men, said, "It is strange that you should not be angry when you meet a man with an ill-conditioned body, and yet be vexed when you encounter one with an ill-conditioned soul." We know that there are deformed bodies, and we are equally certain that there are deformed minds. Of course, society has the right to protect itself, no matter whether the person who attacks its well-being are responsible or not, no matter whether they are sick in mind or deformed in brain. The right of self-defense exists, not only in the individual, but in society. The great question is, how shall this right of self-defense be exercised? What spirit shall be in the nation or in society? The spirit of revenge, a desire to degrade and punish and destroy, or a spirit born of recognition of the fact that criminals are victims? The world has thoroughly tried confiscation, degradation, imprisonment, torture, and death, and thus far the world has failed. In this connection, I call your attention to the following statistics gathered in our own country. In 1850, we had 23 million people and between 6,000 and 7,000 prisoners. In 1860, 31 million people and 19,000 prisoners. In 1870, 38 million people and 32,000 prisoners. In 1880, 50 million people and 58,000 prisoners. It may be curious to note the relation between insanity, pauperism, and crime. In 1850, there were 15,000 insane. In 1860, 24,000. In 1870, 37,000. In 1880, 91,000. In the light of these statistics, we are not succeeding in doing away with crime. There were, in 1880, 58,000 prisoners, and in the same year, 57,000 homeless children, and 66,000 paupers in almshouses. Is it possible that we must go to the same cause for these effects? There is no reformation in degradation. To mutilate a criminal is to say to all the world that he is a criminal and to render his reformation substantially impossible. Whoever is degraded by society becomes its enemy. The seeds of malice are sown in his heart, and to the day of his death he will hate the hand that sowed the seeds. There is also another side to this question. A punishment that degrades the punished will degrade the man who inflicts the punishment, and will degrade the government that procures the infliction. The whipping post pollutes not only the whipped, but the whipper, and not only the whipper, but the community at large. Wherever its shadow falls, it degrades. If, then, there is no reforming power in degradation, no deterrent power, for the reason that the degradation of the criminal degrades the community, and in this way produces more criminals, then the next question is whether there is any reforming power in torture. The trouble with this is that it hardens and degrades to the last degree the ministers of the law. Those who are not affected by the agonies of the bad will in a little time care nothing for the sufferings of the good. There seems to be a little of the wild beast in men, something that is fascinated by suffering and that delights in inflicting pain. When a government tortures, it is in the same state of mind that the criminal was when he committed his crime. It requires as much malice in those who execute the law to torture a criminal as it did in the criminal to torture and kill his victim. The one was a crime by a person, the other by a nation. There is something in injustice and cruelty that tends to defeat itself. There were never as many traitors in England as when the traitor was drawn and quartered, when he was tortured in every possible way, when his limbs, torn and bleeding, were given to the fury of mobs or exhibited pierced by pikes or hung in chains. These frightful punishments produced intense hatred for the government, and traitors continued to increase until they became powerful enough to decide what treason was and who the traitors were, and to inflict the same torment on others. Think for a moment of what man has suffered in the cause of crime. Think of the millions that have been imprisoned, impoverished, and degraded because they were thieves and forgers, swindlers and cheats. Think for a moment of what they have endured, of the difficulties under which they have pursued their calling. And it will be exceedingly hard to believe that they were sane and natural people, possessed of good brains, of minds well poised, and that they did what they did from a choice unaffected by heredity and countless circumstances that tend to determine the conduct of human beings. The other day I was asked these questions. Has there been as much heroism displayed for the right as for the wrong? Has virtue as many martyrs as vice? For hundreds of years, the world has endeavored to destroy the good by force. The expression of honest thought was regarded as the greatest of crimes. Dungeons were filled by the noblest and best, and the blood of the bravest was shed by the sword or consumed by flames. It was impossible to destroy the longing in the heart of man for liberty and truth. It is not possible that brute force and cruelty and revenge, imprisonment, torture, and death are as impotent to do away with vice as to destroy virtue. In our country, there has been for many years a growing feeling that convicts should neither be degraded nor tortured. It was provided in the Constitution of the United States that cruel and unusual punishments should not be inflicted. Benjamin Franklin took great interest in the treatment of prisoners. Being a thorough believer in the reforming influence of justice, having no confidence whatever in punishment for punishment's sake. To me, it has always been a mystery how the average man, knowing something of the weakness of human nature, something of the temptations to which he himself has been exposed, remembering the evil of his life, the things he would have done had there been opportunity, had he absolutely known that discovery would be impossible, should have feelings of hatred toward the imprisoned. Is it possible that the average man assaults the criminal in a spirit of self-defense? Does he wish to convince his neighbors that the evil thought and impulse were never in his mind? Are his words a shield that he uses to protect himself from suspicion? For my part, I sympathize sincerely with all failures, with the victims of society, with those who have fallen, with the imprisoned, with the hopeless, with those who have been stained by verdicts of guilty, and with those who, in the moments of passion, have destroyed, as with a blow, the future of their lives. How perilous, after all, is the state of man. It is the work of a life to build a great and splendid character. It is the work of a moment to destroy it utterly. From turret to foundation. How cruel hypocrisy is. And I think we'll stop there. Yep. That is the end of part 1 of Little Blue Book number 139, titled Crimes Against Criminals. An address by Robert G Ingersoll, dated 1890. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 2.